Okay, so you remember that last week at the end of step 6 that what we were talking about was why doesn't God remove these character defects quicker? Do you remember that? That was the number one question that you guys asked me this month. But there's a second question that was the second most popular question, and I want to address that today, even as we move into step 7, because, as always, it's so cool that our questions and our yearnings and our longings tend to take us through the 12-step process, and indeed your questions did just that for me. The second question that you asked me the most last month is, why did God do this to me? Why did God do this to me? Now here's the deal. We always rush to explain away the fact that God could not possibly have done whatever that thing is to us. We want to say, well, this couldn't be God. God is good, and He is. God doesn't tempt anyone, and He doesn't. God is kind and loving, would not do an act of unkindness, and that's all true. But that's not the only truth. And the other part of that truth is what I want to talk to you about today. So look at your scripture that's in your outline, and it's a Message translation of James 4:4-6. Is it in your outline? Okay, Phyllis fixed that, or somebody fixed it for me. Great. Okay, so let's look at it. And this is what it says. It says, you're cheating on God if all you want is your own way, flirting with the world every chance you get. You end up enemies of God and His way. And do you suppose God doesn't care? The proverb has it that He's a fiercely jealous lover, and what He gives in love is far better than anything else you'll find. It's common knowledge that God goes against the willful proud, and God gives grace to the willing humble. And so here's a really hard truth that I don't think many people really want to think about, and I don't particularly want to talk about it. But it's truth nonetheless. And it is that sometimes God did do it to you. Sometimes God did do it to you. And let me show you why. The first word in this section that's underlined is the word is. And although we laugh at Bill Clinton when he says it depends on what your definition of is, in this case, it actually matters what your definition of is. Because this word is the Greek word kathistemi, and I'm not pronouncing it right, but I don't care, so we're going to go on. And it means to render, to constitute, to choose a path with a result. So when it says that if all you want is your way, it means that you have chosen a path that is going to have an inevitable result. That there's going to be an inevitable outcome for this path. And so what is does matter, this path you've chosen. And that when you choose this path, and you choose your own way, rather than the humility that comes from being teachable and completely surrendered to exactly the path that God chooses for us to walk on, which is what we talked about last week, having the discipline to do the next right thing, not just the thing that feels right, then it says that God becomes an enemy to us, which is the word echthros. And this word means an enemy in war, hostile, antagonistic, with animosity, one who is in the midst of the act of war. So sometimes God does do it to you. Because when we are in a state of pride and arrogance, God opposes you. When we are in a state of doing it our own way and thinking we don't need God, God becomes your enemy. In fact, in the last word this last word, antitasa, is to resist, oppose, go against. It is the military term for a well-executed plan of attack against one's enemy. So, it does too matter how we ask. Humility is exceedingly important because the opposite of humility is pride. And in that moment when we live in arrogance and pride, we actually become the enemy of God, and that is what is when we choose that path. Can you even believe it? Do you think that sells as well as God's unconditional grace and mercy? Do you think that's as comforting a verse as Galatians 5:1 that says that Christ came to set us free? It is not sexy to say that God Himself, in the midst of arrogance and pride, becomes our carefully crafted foe, but it is true. And so, although sometimes we want to deny the fact that God is actually acting in opposition to us because it offends our sensibilities, it diminishes our view of God being Santa-like and benevolent, it is truth, and we must wrestle with it. So I suppose that the next point that needs to be made is in the top right corner of your outline. And it says this: because the next question that follows, why did God do this to me, is the second question, which is, I think the devil's having a field day. This is spiritual warfare, and no doubt that is true. But let's be careful how we define the spirit that we are warring with. And look what Rick Renner says. He says, the Christian can rebuke the devil all day long, but it will be to no avail, for his problem is not the devil. His problem is God. As terrible as this resistance sounds, it is a manifestation of God's grace. By blocking our way and resisting our choices, the precious Holy Spirit endeavors to get our attention and to bring us to a sweet place of brokenness where sin is confessed and fellowship with God is restored. God's primary, number one concern for us is that we be restored unto Him, because it is only as we live in intimate connection with Him that He can supply us what we need to fulfill His big dream for us. And so when we enter into a lifestyle choice or a persistent pattern of thinking or an acquiescing to feelings and thoughts and fantasies that are in opposition to His truth, you have taken on a mighty big foe. So do you want to think about perhaps what the difference is between pride and humility? Because there's this thing called false humility too. So let's see if we can draw a compare and contrast, and then let's talk about why we do this, and then we're done. Okay? Here's some of the things that humility says. Humility says, this isn't working, and I've got a part in it. Something about my life isn't working, and I've got a part in it. Arrogance says, this isn't working, and it's got to be somebody else's fault. Humility says, this isn't working, what's my part? And I want to say to you that in every marriage, and unfortunately, girls, I think a lot of times it's us. In every marriage relationship, there is one who likes to bring up the problems of the other. It's not usually two, because two can't handle it. Then you end up in bigger heap of trouble. But in a marriage relationship, it's never just one person's fault. It's always 100% two people's responsibility. And humility in working with the sticky wickets and the lows of a marital relationship, a humble marriage partner says, this isn't working. I wonder what my part is. Because we've always got a part. Humility says, I could be wrong. And then actually follows up with that thought to figure out what that might be. Arrogance says, pride says, I am right. And not only am I right, but it's my highest value. Do you realize that for the desperately devoted follower of Christ, one can be right, and that's not the central point. The central point in the gospel message is not who's right, it's who's in right relationship with God, self, and others. Being right is not the highest value of a believer. It's being in right relationship. And humility gets that. Humility says, I may have missed something. There may be information I don't know. There may be choices I haven't experienced. There may be options that haven't occurred to me. Not so arrogance. Arrogance says, don't confuse me with the facts. I want my way. Humility says, I bet there's a bigger perspective here than just mine. Arrogance says, you just don't get what I'm saying. Humility says, whatever this it thing is, this thing that I want, this thing that I long for, this understanding that I need, this perspective that I desire, it might take days, months, or years for me to grasp it. And during that time, I sit myself at the feet at whatever community I need in order to get it. Pride says, I want it now. I've decided what it is. I'm going for it regardless of the cost. Humility says, I can't do this myself. Arrogance says, get out of my way. I know how to do it better than you. Humility says, who should I ask? Arrogance says, who must I tell? Humility chooses to listen. Pride and arrogance always rushes to speak. Humility says, I will ask for feedback. Pride says, I can't wait to give my feedback. Humility says there are other possibilities, there are other choices, there are other ways to think than I'm considering. And so I must proceed with caution in my thought life and in my decision making. Arrogance says, I have a perspective that I need to share. It's limited, but it's right. Humility says, I'm not unique. Others have gone before me, and I can learn from their perspective. Arrogance says, I'm so unique that you cannot possibly understand me. Humility says, the most important thing here is not whether I'm right or not. Arrogance says, it's all about me being right and getting you to agree. What drives this kind of thought process? What is it that causes us to choose one side over the other? Because you know as well as I do that we're in the pride and arrogant place. We don't realize we are. We think we're being helpful. Correct? I mean, we're sharing necessary information for the well-being of others. See, here's the thing. It occurs to me, because I have the privilege of listening to people's stories day in and day out. It occurs to me that a lot of times we fail to understand our place and our power in our own story. That we don't understand how our choices are affecting our own life script. So we don't understand it, why our spouse pulls away from us, but we fail to recognize that we're wearing a very prickly shirt. We don't understand why we don't get that raise or promotion at work. But that's probably because somebody's failed to maybe feel comfortable enough to give us the information that we're not doing that great a job. We don't understand why our spouse doesn't want to cuddle every night. Why our spouse doesn't just jump at our every call. Well, maybe we're barking instead of inviting an opportunity for relationship. We don't understand why that person just won't stop doing that thing that they do. We feel like it's to annoy us, but what it really is medicating the pain of being in relationship with us. Ouch. But it's true. We are, to quote Austin Powers, we are not all, if we're going to go highbrow, we may as well just follow through with the whole thing. We are not all that in a bag of potato chips too. We are not, have not ever been, and here's the most amazing thing, God doesn't require us to be, but if we keep acting like we are, we're going to find ourselves without a lot of relationships. And although that seems like a good idea right now, 30, 60, 90 days or 12 years into it, we're going to wake up and realize we're not alone because we chose it. We're lonely because we have no choice, because nobody will hang out with us anymore. So why do we do that? Why does that happen to us? Certainly we don't intentionally choose it. Well, there's this thing called distorted thinking. And there's this guy that's written this book called Addictive Thinking by Abraham Tversky, and it's very good. And I'm going to talk to you about it for a few minutes now. And it's an excellent book. But what I would suggest is that Abraham perhaps missed his target audience. Because when he called it addictive thinking, it's as if to say that only addicts think like this, and that's not true. Everybody who fails to live in this broken, humbled place of saying, it could be me, I could be wrong, what's my part in this, is a person who develops distorted thinking. And so people who are depressed have distorted thinking. People with anxiety disorders have distorted thinking. People who have lived in the midst of addictive family systems have distorted thinking. Oh yes, and addicts do indeed have distorted thinking. People who are in the midst of a painful situation have distorted thinking because they're working so hard to avoid the pain that sometimes they're missing the process. Distorting thinking happens to all of us. We don't need to put a label on it. So as I go through some of these thoughts, which I think are the thoughts that contribute to a sense of mistakes were made but not by me attitude, is this kind of distorted thinking. So as I'm going through it, I want you to just really ask the Holy Spirit, because it has to be a Holy Spirit thing, to say to you, is this me? And the reason I want you to do that has a biblical text to it. Do you remember when Jesus was having the Last Supper with the disciples, and he was going to try to cue them up to the fact that he was getting ready to get crucified? Do you remember when he was talking to them, he said a really hard truth to them? Sort of like the truth I'm saying to you, like, dude, a lot of your problems could actually be related to you. And what he said in that really hard truth to the disciples is he said, one of you is going to betray me. Now you know, these guys had been living together for 3 years. There were 12 of them. They had worked together. They had partied together. They had played together. They had fought for number one position together. They had showed a lot of pride and arrogance. And here's the thing, one of the many things that I find so amazing about John 13's story. Not one of them knew who the betrayer was going to be. Not one of them knew that. And I think that was a God thing. Because I got to tell you something. If I had been hanging out for 3 years with 12 people, I would have probably had opinion on that. You know, maybe a couple of the more gentle, merciful ones in the group would have said, it's got to be Peter. He is such an arrogant so-and-so, always running his mouth. Somebody else could have said, it could not be Peter. It has got to be Judas. He is the accountant in the group. He's always over in the corner counting the gold coins. It has got to be Judas. But none of them did that. All of them did this one thing that I'm asking of you that really only God can do for you. I want you for 1 minute to set aside the fact that you think it's your spouse's fault or your kid's fault or your parents' fault. And I want you to ask yourself one question. Could it be me? Could this be me? So now let's see what I want you to ask yourselves about. People who lose their place in the story and lose the utter essence of humility about who they are and where they need to be are people who often have very distorted thinking. And let me describe some of those distorted thoughts to you. You may have about you a superficial logic that can be seductive and misleading. It could be girls that sometimes when we're hanging out with each other and dissing our husbands, when we think that we're being perfectly reasonable and logical in agreeing with each other and saying, how could he? That maybe we're not being the best friends to each other we could be. I don't mean to be picking on my gender, but if the shoe fits some of us, we probably need to wear it. Distorted thinking isn't so out there and crazy that somebody brings a paddy wagon and locks you up. And that's what makes it so tricky. So we can begin conversations in our head or with each other, and we can talk ourselves out of a marriage or talk ourselves out of our place in the story and feel completely justified by it. That doesn't make it right. So not only do we have to be careful as individuals, as groups we have to be careful about our conversation and offering always the opportunity to say to our friends when they're in the midst of whining mode, and if they look like they're open to feedback, if they are not, just keep your yap shut. But if they are, to say, well, what do you think your part could be? And that should probably only happen about once or twice a year because most people aren't open to feedback. All right. The next point. Slip that right in there, and only 4 if you got it. Okay. Here's the next point. It is not related to intelligence. So you can be a person who is highly successful in some area of your life and still be a complete goof. Because distorted thinking is craziness wrapped in a really good package. That doesn't mean you're a dummy. It just means you have distorted thinking. So sometimes we who might think of ourselves as being successful and capable and able to do one thing well, we look at that and say, well, it's got to be her because I'm really doing this one thing quite well. So be careful about that. Distorted thinking is always at its core primarily self-deception. and it is intensely resistant to change. Distorted thinking is at its core primarily self-deception, and it is intensely resistant to change, which is why finding humility in the midst of distorted thinking is such a hard concept to come by. So we need to understand this about ourselves, that if we live in an addictive family system, if we've shown any inclination that sometimes our judgment is a little left as plumb, understand and be gentle with ourselves about this. We are just naturally resistant to change. So if we believe that the world doesn't love us and the world is against us, then the world will not love us and will be against us, even if the world is loving us well. Because we're going to see it differently. Because we are at our core self-deceptive and resistant to change. Now here's a really interesting thing about distorted thinkers and addicted thinkers in particular. Did you know that people actually have internal clocks that measure time differently? And particularly addicted people measure time in seconds and minutes. So when an addicted person says to us, I can stop any time, and they sound quite arrogant about it, they mean it, because what they mean by any time is for 10 minutes. Make no mistake. When an addict speaks with confidence that they have stopped or can stop, their big win is 10 minutes. Am I right or wrong about that? 10 minutes is a big win. So we need to be careful with the measurement of time and understand that God's time isn't like that. And so sometimes Him working things in and through and with us takes considerably longer than seconds or minutes, and we've got to hang with the process. Distorted thinking often requires immediate gratification when we think in seconds or minutes. So we can't just sit with things. We can't wait. We can't let God have the time to marinate and let the yeast go in and let the thing build. We're poking a stick at requiring change, and change immediately. This is one of my personal favorites. Is that distorted thinkers blame reverse cause and effect. So, hypothetically speaking, if I ever drove above the speed limit, hypothetically speaking, and if I were going down Huguenot Road and wasn't an eagle-sharp eye and actually didn't see the police officer at the side of the road, and I got a ticket, in an undistorted thought life, that's again hypothetical that I would have it, in an undistorted thought life, I would get home, and at dinner that night when we were all saying what we did that day, I would say, I was speeding on Huguenot Road and I got a ticket. A distorted thinker does not think that way. A distorted thinker would say, if I were in my distorted thinking place, we'd be sitting around dinner and I would go, the craziest thing happened to me today. I was driving down Huguenot Road minding my own business, thinking about godly things like my message this week. And before I knew it, there were these blue lights behind me. They pulled me over. I couldn't even believe it happened. Well, if all you were doing was driving down the road, nothing did happen. Well, while he was there, he gave me a speeding ticket. Can you even believe my bad luck? God was not looking out for me today. That's distorted thinking. That's confusing cause and effect. The guy with the little blue lights, as a general rule, has more things to do with his time. Donuts to buy, coffee to drink. If we are following the laws, they, as a general rule, don't pull us over. Do you know how many times the average person drives under the influence before they get a DUI, according to some statistical guru on the National Addiction website? In excess of 200 times the average person dies. And I've never seen anybody get a DUI and say, I'm busted, I deserved it, I have done this 239 times without getting caught. I deserve this. I bet if we had a judge in our midst, that they would nod their head in agreement that yes, that sometimes people come to court with crazy excuses. That's the reversing cause and effect. My wife makes me drink. What? Might have been reversing cause and effect. Okay? You got that cause and effect reversal thing, right? All right, let's keep going. Addictive thinkers and distorted thinkers, important, are constitutionally incapable of making healthy decisions for themselves. Now, we tend to think that this is a short-term problem and will be alleviated as soon as we put down the bottle, or we stop going to the porn website, or we start using drugs illegally or using illicit drugs. That's not true. When we are distorted thinkers, we have a predisposition to not be able to consistently make healthy choices for ourselves. This is a truth about us. But it's going to require humility to change it. You're going to need a committee. You know, Hillary Clinton was right. It takes a village. Now, I don't know about the child part. Maybe 2 parents and a couple of good friends can do that. But it takes a village to raise an addicted thinker. It takes a village to raise a distorted thinker. So that a woman who is used to living sort of in a fantasy world and believing that life is sort of a fantasy, when she gets together with her girlfriends, your girlfriends need to tell you the truth. Expecting your husband to always pick up his underwear is fantasy living. That doesn't mean he's not a good husband. If we would have the humility to know that we do not consistently possess the capacity to make healthy choices for ourselves, what would we do differently in our life? Yeah, we would try to seek out healthy people. Would we always choose healthy people? No, sometimes we're even going to make a mistake in that. So that's why it's good to have a community and a consensus.
I would like to say, though, that for us, when we get together, it's only as effective if one of us comes up and is honest about what's really going on. Because when we get together, your community can only help you. If I have an issue and I'm not honest,
right,
complete about it,
right,
they can give all the advice they want, but it's not going to help if I go into it.
Do you think, from your vast experience with your own addictive thinking, that it's possible that sometimes an addictive thinker maybe edits the story a bit to try to get the desired response?
I think for the first couple of years, I think that's just normal for people.
So are you telling me that to be a consistently healthy person, that probably living in community is good, but intimacy is essential? So you can have a community of people, but there needs to be one person who knows the whole deal.
For me, yes. And that would call me on it when I was beating around the bush or just flat out lying. Would love me enough to call me on it.
So calling someone on their stuff is really a loving thing.
Didn't feel that way when they did it.
Well, I know, but I didn't ask you how it felt.
But yes.
Okay. All right. Addicted people live in denial of what's real and what's true. Let me tell you about that, because this is really important. In our distorted thinking, sometimes we forget the thing that's most real and most true. So when I'm anxious and feeling uncomfortable, one of the things that I like to do is I like my house to get immediately immaculate. I don't know why. It's sort of a compulsive thing. So when I sort of get disturbed internally, I try to control my external world. Can anybody relate to that?
Oh, yes.
Okay. And, you know, I'm like that less frequently now, so if any of you are having a bad day and want to come clean my house, feel free. But when I do that, I sort of have a spell. And my children can describe it and probably act it out for you in great detail, but I have a spell, and it usually involves getting really annoyed about the shoes. Because we tend to leave our shoes where we leave them, and most of the time this doesn't bother me, but when I have a spell, it does. I haven't had a spell in a while related to shoes. Because one day it occurred to me that I was not being real and true. And that by far the higher value for me, rather than where our shoes were or how straight our house was, is that I have loving relationship with my boys and my husband. And having unpredictable fits of rage as a result of a few hundred pair of shoes lying around in the den is not the core value that even I believe in. So sometimes we, in our distorted thinking, begin to harp on things that are inconsistent with our own core values. And we begin to produce results in our life that go against the very thing we believe in. Perfect movie example, The Breakup. Did you see The Breakup? Jennifer Aniston breaks up with Vince Vaughn, which is a foreshadowing of real life, if People magazine is any indication. And Jennifer Aniston never wanted to break up with him. She just wanted him to do the dishes. He never wanted to break up with her. He just wanted to be able to play whatever that computer game was, Xbox or Nintendo or whatever, uninterrupted. They ended up broken up because neither one of them was willing to speak real and true about what their core value is. You know what? I'll tell you what. I suspect that if we went to our spouses and we said, my highest value is loving you, and something is keeping me and us from experiencing that right now, what am I doing? What is my part in this? I suspect we'd have more shoes picked up in our house than you could shake a stick at. And it would be both real and true. But yelling about the shoes, or telling Peter, you're just doing something wrong that's making me unhappy, makes him watch more ESPN than less. But to say to him, you are my main man. And what's real and true for me is I love you. And I want to have relationship with you. Honey, don't you think that's sexy? He thinks that's sexy. And so if we then say, well, what's standing in our way? I'm saying, it says 400 pair of shoes in the den. He pitches a hissy fit. Those boys have picked up those shoes in 20 seconds flat. Because then all of a sudden, it becomes our problem, not his. Think about what's real and true and what's really important to you. That kid that's driving you crazy, is it really their cessation of their bad behaving that you want? Or what do you want? Do you want them to find their true God-created self? Isn't that what you want? Well, there might be a different way to do that than putting a GPS locator system on the bottom of their car. Just a thought. Distorted thinkers project blame on others for things that they are really responsible for, and that reinforces denial and the status quo. So here's the other thing about us when we're addictively thinking or distortedly thinking. We want to maintain the status quo, and we will maintain that at the expense of marriages, expense of relationship with children, expense of really good jobs, expense of our own happiness. Because the thing we fear the most is change. So I'm asking you today to say to yourself, what area am I resistant to changing in? What area have I been so sure that I'm right in that I haven't been willing to consider another way? I have distorted thinking. This predisposition within me says I want to maintain the status quo. I don't want to look at myself. I don't want to know the real deal. That's within us and with other distorted thinkers. So, we need to be patient with ourselves and others. The other thing that we do is that we think in extremes without much understanding that there is flexibility to the resolution of problems. And so on any given day, you're reasonably happy in your marriage, and the next day you're filing papers. How did that happen? How did you get there? And if you pause to prepare, what could have been some intermediate steps in between along the way, some gentle interventions that could have made it different for us? We are extremists in our thoughts, and we bounce from one thing to the other, one extreme to the other. Calm down. Pause to prepare. Here's another one that's really good. When we have been abused, neglected, or treated poorly in early life, that is very traumatic for us. And children do not have the skill set to be resilient to that kind of trauma. Children are not resilient. And they have consequences for trauma and emotional upset and chaos and confusion and disruption. And so when that happens, this is a neurological thing that happens. Our brains, and it recognizes itself in our emotions and brains become very sensitive. I want you to recognize the fact that if you have any kind of trauma, abuse, or neglect in your background, that it's very possible that your brain is as tender and damaged as if you had been through a serious fire and had third-degree burns on it. Trauma and stress and the pumping out of cortisol and other stress hormones actually wipes out the things that cover your nerve endings called the myelin sheath. And you become so hypersensitive emotionally that you become very difficult for people to live with and around. Now, I'm not saying that to you to say, "Whoa, they're so sensitive." I'm saying that to you to say, you are so sensitive and there's a reason for it, but it makes you difficult to live with. It's not an either or, it's a both and recognize that. And acknowledge that about yourself. So when your sensitive feelings are about to get hurt, or they do get hurt, recognize that there is a physiological reason for that. And it may not necessarily be directly related to the circumstances that you are currently experiencing. Our children just got back from a mission trip really late last night, and Peter and I decided that we were going to do something different. I think we're going to change this plan. We decided to do something different. We decided not to ask them any questions. Because, you ask them questions and, we say, "How was Mexico?" And they'll say, "It's hot." And "How was your trip?" And "It was fine." And "How was the food?" "It was okay." And you don't get anything out of them. So we said, this just questioning thing isn't working for us. We're not going to ask any questions. We were up to almost 3 o'clock in the morning with them telling us stuff. And I was like, wow, if we'd asked some questions, we could have been in bed 2 hours ago. So one of the things they were talking about is this guy by the name of Johann, who worked for this missions organization. And they were like, his rage button is 0 to 700. He says they'd say, "Now we're moving to our teams," and Johann would get up there and say, "I said move to your teams." And the guy yelled and moved them off and on buses, and they went from rage to 0 to 700 in 40 seconds or less every time. Look, if your emotional response is 0 to 70, if it's faster than Jackie's car, it's probably not your circumstances. Now, the fact that there is something in Johann's background that has resulted in him acting like this was of absolutely no interest to our boys. All they know is he's difficult to work with, and they are never going on another mission trip with this organization again, at least not till next summer, when they forget about it. So I just want to say to you that if we find ourselves with people that are hypersensitive, there's a reason for it, and we can be gracious to it, but we do not have to tolerate it as if it's good for them. More on that later. One of the things that you and I tend to do, and then I'm going to stop, even though I've got 3 more pages, is because of all these things I've mentioned, is that we tend to become isolated and socially withdrawn. This is the nature of distorted thinking. Hey, it's perfectly logical in that superficial logic kind of way. Because if I isolate and withdraw and fail to respond to environmental cues around me, I am setting off less firestorms in my 3rd-degree burned brain. So sometimes being in relationship with people is so painful that we begin to withdraw and disconnect. There's absolutely no value in that strategy. Because what that does is it keeps us from learning what we need to learn and how to relate to people better. In a moment, it seems comfortable. But what I know is this, and I want to leave you with this thought. It cannot possibly be real or true. Because when God sets His highest values for us, He says this: do not use your freedom to indulge your sinful nature, but instead learn how to love one another, to serve one another in love. People, we were created for community, and taking ourselves out of the community takes us, guarantees us, takes us out of the opportunity to live God's big dream for us. So I hope you think about these things this week and ponder them. And I hope you take this list, those of you who've written them down, and I hope you don't use them as a weapon on someone else. I hope you turn the light of that on yourself and say, like the disciples thought in that upper room, could it be me?